Right before his last public discourse, Jesus tells his disciples, "Now my soul is troubled. What should I say? Father, save me from this hour? But that is why I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." And then a voice came from heaven. "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." The crowd standing there heard it and said it was thunder. Others said that an angel had spoken to him. There are 3 instances of God speaking audibly during the ministry of Jesus. The first was at the baptism of Jesus, the second at the transfiguration, and the third is here in John chapter 12 after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, only days before his crucifixion. God the Father broke the silence of heaven to encourage his Son in the final days of his mission on earth. I've always found the idea of hearing the voice of God to be fascinating. I mean, think about it. The all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe speaks to us, his creation. I've always believed in God. Now, it may have taken me a while to surrender my life to him, but I've always believed he existed. I remember being in Sunday school or at church camps as a kid and listening to others share their experiences of times they've heard from God. I remember feeling left out because I'd never heard God speak, or hadn't realized it if I had. Because I had never personally heard from God, it caused me to see relationship with God as more of a theory or a practice, rather than a real interaction. After years of getting to know God and being in relationship with his people, I've come to realize that I'm not the only one that has struggled with hearing the voice of God. The truth is, God speaks. It's plain here in John 12. A voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The interesting thing about this announcement from the sky is that some people heard the voice and knew that it was God. Like John, for instance, the author of the book. However, not everyone who heard understood. Some people thought it was thunder. Others thought it was an angel speaking. But regardless of how it was interpreted, none could doubt that it was supernatural. Also in John chapter 10, Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." So the question is, if God says he speaks and that we hear his voice, why don't we recognize it? Let's try to answer that question with a practical illustration. Have you ever had a moment during worship where you felt a sense of God's presence? Not necessarily a voice or some big revelation, but rather a sense of comfort or peace that just felt close, like the veil between heaven and earth was thinner than usual. Newborn babies have a similar experience after birth. I think back to when my son Urban was born. When he came out of the womb, everything about his environment changed dramatically and abruptly. The sudden air, bright light, and temperature change caused him to communicate his discomfort in the only way he knew how. He cried. But soon after, he was given to his mother. She held him and began to calm him with a soothing and reassuring tone. And within minutes, the crying faded and he fell asleep. Urban didn't know who his mother was in an intellectual sense. He wasn't thinking, "This is my mother, and she's telling me that everything is going to be okay, so therefore the logical thing for me to do is stop crying." He was barely 2 minutes old. It wasn't the words that were spoken that comforted him. He didn't know the language. He knew the presence and the voice of his mother, and that was what assured him that he was okay. That's how it works with God too. Before we are saved, our whole lives have been spent separated from him, and though we may be familiar with his presence, we don't know his language. So we can hear his voice, but not understand what he's saying. Just like the crowd in our story. So how do we learn God's language? We study his word. We hide his truth in our heart so that when God has something to say to us, it's already present in us and can be easily brought to the surface. The reality is this: just like learning a new language takes time and practice, so does learning the language of God. It's a process of continued spiritual growth and maturity. We must be intentional to move from a state of spiritual infancy to spiritual adulthood. There's so much more to be said about hearing the voice of God, but for now, it's enough to say that you cannot learn the language of God's character and heart if you do not invest the time to learn it. This is more than just a 15-minute time slot a day. It's a lifestyle that is desperate for the abundant life found in God's Word. So if you find it difficult to hear from God, or you want to have a deeper, more adult relationship with Him. You have to decide. Am I satisfied with an infant-like relationship with God? Or am I desperate enough for Him that I'm willing to abandon the language and culture of this world in favor of the language and words that give life, and life abundantly?